but got the job and was taken into Bill's office and met Bill. And for the next 2.5 years, because it's a stint job, I spent a lot of time with Bill, traveling and working on speeches, internal and external, doing international events and things like that.
Hey there, Solar Warriors. I'm Nico Johnson, and this is Suncast. Each week, I pull back the veil on the life and business insights of clean tech entrepreneurs building the most noble and impactful companies of our time. I hope what you learn from this conversation is a catalyst for your own growth. So thanks for tuning in, and welcome to our tribe. Hey Warrior, today's episode is jam-packed, so I'll try to keep this short and sweet, but I am jazzed about the guest that we have on today. Jeff Ressler, CEO of Clean Power Research, has had a remarkable career. From designing the park experience at Disneyland to designing the user and audience experience at Microsoft, he's learned firsthand how world-class thinkers leverage data and software to improve the lives of customers. Jeff and I cover a ton of ground in this fascinating interview, from why he left Microsoft for clean energy to how his company's products help solar installers and utilities alike manage the ever-expanding complexity of renewable energy integration. We even get into the story of how he scored their sweet URL, cleanpower.com. Tune in today's episode to learn how he graduated college without a job and ultimately ended up traveling the world with Bill Gates for 2+ years, and hear what compelled him to leave the nest at Microsoft to grow and eventually run the software company that helped launch and manage the California Solar Initiative. If you're in the Suncast Guild, you'll get even more great stories in the private feed, as I'm going to be publishing the behind-the-scenes pre-interview that I did with Jeff, where he goes into even more detail about how and why he made each transition in his career, including how he negotiated his roles at Microsoft and even how he negotiated his internship at Disney, and so much that we couldn't fit into this episode. Well, if you're new to Suncast, I encourage you to head over to mysuncast.com, where you can see our more than 200 episode catalog of inspiring and influential clean tech leaders' stories. You might also want to check out the Guild, which I just mentioned, and hop on our tribe mailing list. You can stay up to date with all our goings on. That's also how you'll get the details to attend our tribe-exclusive Ask Me Anything, which I'll be hosting with Jeff in the coming weeks. Date to be announced only in the tribe newsletter, so jump in it. For now, get ready to tune up your skills, Solar Warrior, as we tune in to another powerful conversation here on Suncast. All right, Solar Warriors. Today, we're going to discuss not just the present and future of clean energy, but reminisce a little down memory lane with a software executive that has transitioned their career. Mr. Jeff Ressler is Chief Executive Officer of Clean Power Research. Perhaps it's a company you've heard of before or used their products. In his more than 10 years at the company, Jeff has grown their flagship product, Power Clerk, into the industry-leading energy program automation solution. He's also overseen the inception, introduction, and growth of Solar Anywhere and WattPlan, another software family that they have introduced to the industry. As a software industry veteran, Jeff has deep experience building effective cross-functional teams. And today, we're going to have a fun ride with Jeff, learning how he made the transition from corporate America to clean energy. Jeff, welcome to Suncast.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here, Nico.
So, Jeff, I am curious to understand so much about what I've come to learn of your trajectory and your past. But first and foremost, as I got to know a bit about how you came to the sort of the software industry, the thing that stuck out to me and probably is a fun conversation piece for you at most dinner parties, I'm curious to understand how, as a product manager in a relatively sort of junior to mid-level position at Microsoft, you rose to the position of speechwriter for Bill Gates, and I'd love to hear what exactly that job entailed as well.
Sure. Yeah. So I joined Microsoft after spending a year at Oracle. So I got out of school in 1996, spent a year at Oracle in Redwood Shores as a product manager, and then met a recruiter for Microsoft at Oracle Open World. He was not clearly identifying himself as a recruiter for Microsoft. He was actually a Microsoft employee recruiting, in fact. I had a conversation with him, and I had an open mind about going to Microsoft. So I headed up there in 1997, and I became a product manager on the tools team. And I was a product manager on Visual C++, and then later on C# and what came to be called .NET. And that was a great team to be on, working with a relatively small team by Microsoft standards in those days, a couple hundred people that were doing tools inside the company from a development and product management standpoint. But we were building things that people were using all over the world, including most of the people in Silicon Valley writing software for Windows. And at that time, late 90s, Windows, of course, was just the dominant OS for consumers and businesses. So yeah, I was happily sort of going along as a product manager. I ended up getting pulled onto the SQL Server team. Some of my bosses left the tools team and went to databases to work on SQL Server. And I was pulled over to help them launch SQL Server 2000, and happily acting as a lead product manager on that product when I got a call, and the voice on the other end of the line, I could tell it was an internal call on my phone there at my desk at Microsoft. And the voice on the other end of the line said, "Would you be interested in interviewing to be Bill Gates' speechwriter?" And I said, "I don't think I'm qualified, but I'd be happy to talk to you guys." And that sort of started me on this journey of working for Bill. And that person on the other end of the line was Bill's speech manager at that time, a guy named Stephen Van Roekel. And so I went through a bunch of interviews and didn't even talk to Bill, actually, which I found odd since I hadn't met Bill to that time. Been at the company almost 4 years.
Wow.
But got the job and was taken into Bill's office and met Bill. And for the next 2.5 years, because it's a stint job, I spent a lot of time with Bill, traveling and working on speeches, internal and external, doing international events and things like that.
I'm curious if you have any sense of why you were targeted as a candidate. And after that, I'd love to hear what that first interaction with Bill was like, having not met him before.
The tradition with that role was that internal people were hired, people with good product knowledge, people that were good with press and analyst relations, but also technical, could understand Bill, could sort of probe the depths of the company to find the interesting things that were being worked on, whether that was in research or in a product group or something an international subsidiary might be doing on a sort of humanitarian basis or a charity basis somewhere. Sort of find those things, coalesce them into interesting stories, and then help Bill tell those stories at different events. And so that internal knowledge was important. That product managers had a lot of the skill around talking to the press and talking to the public and helping craft stories and messages. And then coming out of tools and SQL Server, I certainly had a pretty strong technical background. Always had an affinity to tools and people out of the tools group. And I think if you look at their exec staff today, you see that pretty well reflected. So it was consistent with the trajectory of a couple other people who had that job before me.
How did you prepare for that interaction? And was there anything in particular that surprised you about moving into that job that you didn't expect?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I hadn't met Bill before. I did an interview with him. And so I sort of walked into his office. I was certainly nervous. I was introduced by an outgoing speech manager, and Bill and I hit it off really quickly, actually. We were both very curious people. I like to read a lot. That's certainly one of the ways I prepped was reading and having my ducks in a row and providing context for where and who he might be speaking to. I remember a good example being a speech he made before the Italian Senate, sort of doing some historical research around that so he could have some sort of powerful allusions to draw in his speech there. Just that passion for software and the effect and change that software could bring, I think were very common traits for us. And I'd love to ask him about sort of how things got started and when he and Paul were starting out and the sort of the history aspect of things. At this time in the early 2000s when I was working for him, as you mentioned, Microsoft was really sort of at the top of its game and done a great job returning to that position, I would say. But things like Comdex and CES were huge events for the company. Bill would speak at those. And a lot of folks from the old days, folks that had been at IBM that originally developed the PC when Paul and Bill were negotiating the MS-DOS, PC-DOS as it was called then, contract with IBM, would show up to these events and they'd let us know, and people wanted to see Bill. And so they'd come backstage, and it was great to sort of be a fly on the wall in those meetings, which were really friendly, sort of reminiscence of the past for those folks. So I actually got to meet some of these people that had been around at that time doing this great work that really propelled personal computing forward. So that was a neat thing. But yeah, just a lot of things in common about curiosity and passion for technology. And it was a great position. I always say that one of the best aspects of the position, it was certainly fun to hang out with Bill and get to know him. And he was very good to me and was my mentor after I left the job as I stayed on at Microsoft. Probably the best thing was having this ability to sort of carte blanche to go around the company and look at all the interesting stuff the company was doing and think about how to showcase that, think about how to tell stories about that. And sometimes that was to inspire people inside. Of course, most often it was designed to inspire people outside the company. And that was just a wonderful thing to get those demos and coordinate those moving parts to make things come together and really present a compelling story.
Yeah, and you moved from product development, product management into very much a product marketing and even commercialization role, which I'm certain has helped in the evolution of the software products that Clean Power Research are bringing to market now. What do you feel like you really learned or had as core takeaways about product marketing through the process of going around with Bill and even getting to, like you said, the carte blanche of all the cool new stuff from Microsoft?
I'd say that just to focus on the core value proposition. What are the differentiating aspects of this product? How is it going to make things better? Delivering that succinctly, proving it. I very much come from the demo culture of Microsoft. It's something we have, and I try to instill here at Clean Power Research. Show our products off and let the things we say be represented in the products, and that has some benefits. It certainly makes it real. You always want to avoid, as a software person, the sort of appearance to your customers or prospects of vaporware, as it's called. And so building things into demos that are real demos running on production environments or demo environments that are basically duplicates of production environments. That's how we do things. That's how we did things there and at Microsoft and how we do things here at Clean Power Research. So Bill was very effective at telling those stories of the products, and especially telling the story of how things fit together. Obviously, he was often talking to large audiences, but when he was talking to small audiences, it was often very senior people. Certainly when he was talking to business audiences, sort of C-level folks, those folks are often concerned, understandably, about what's next. How can I be prepared for what's next? And so Bill did a great job of explaining the moving parts and explaining what was coming next. Sometimes not very popularly. In fact, I think it was Chris Caposello was helping him at this time, but working for him. But Bill famously made a speech to the National Association of Newspapers. I'm getting the name sort of wrong there. Can't remember the exact acronym, but it did not go over well. But the things Bill said about the change that was coming, this was in the mid 90s, 97 probably, or maybe even 96. Those things proved true. And so in that regard, it was prescient. He was doing his job as far as informing them. But sometimes people don't want to hear the directions, and because innovations can be painful in some cases.
It seems that this role is a catapult, not just for someone's career, but also for their continued growth within Microsoft. And as you mentioned, it's only a 2.5-year stint, a very intense one at that. But afterwards, how did your career at Microsoft evolve in a way that you feel prepared you for what you now are sort of living in at Clean Power Research? Right.
So after I left the Bill position, it was supposed to be sort of 2 years, and Bill, to be honest, Bill sort of finally said, "Hey, you have to go do something else now."
No.
I didn't really want to leave. I was having a good time.
Yeah.
But I was in a new relationship with a woman who ended up becoming my wife. Who's my wife today. And so it was a good thing because it was to move on, and not just because it should have been a 2-year stint, but because it was the right thing for me as well. But and I think the executive staff at the company very much saw these sort of chief of staff and speech manager type roles as roles that were, they were certainly preparing people to be leaders inside the company. So I had plenty of conversations as I was getting ready to leave with people around the company about where I would go and what I wanted to do, and things like that, and ended up going to the Exchange team to initially lead technical product management for the Exchange product. So Exchange is the company's mail server. It still sits behind Office 365 for mail, and it's what serves up the web version of Outlook and things like that. And so I joined that team and ended up being the director of the Exchange product. And that was an exciting time because to the point of your question, we were in the early stages of thinking about where enterprise software was headed as far as how it was going to be provided. The company, Microsoft, had a sort of failed effort at a heavy software as a focus bundle of technology with something called Passport, which had an identity component related to it, which some listeners might remember Microsoft Passport being marketed to them. But you could have a passport identity, but behind the scenes, Microsoft, this is in the late 90s, was developing a host of different services that businesses could use for billing and metering and connecting different web services and all sorts of things like that. And it was a little early for that. But by sort of 2005, 2006, the company was in a better position to go out and take some of these properties that were trusted in enterprises around the world, things like Office, Exchange, SQL Server, and start to run them for companies. The Microsoft IT group had actually done some experiments running being the outsourcer for IT for a couple of large American corporations, and that had gone very large companies, Fortune 500 companies, and that had gone quite well. And they were doing that in close conjunction with the Exchange team in particular, because the first service these companies generally wanted automated or outsourced was email. And so with the success of that, we started looking closely at how we were going to offer those services online. And so that originally was called, that became Office, what's now Office 365 was originally called truly Microsoft naming fashion, Business Productivity Online Services, or BPOS. That's an awkward and long name that they finally fixed. But that's what is out there today, that tens of millions of people around the world are using, especially at work, though a lot of people increasingly as consumers are using that same underlying technology. So that was a fun effort to sort of shift the mindset away from large, high scalability on-premise software and towards hosted software, or software as a service, with Microsoft as the hoster in effect, where all those enterprise abilities, scalability, availability, manageability, programmability, et cetera, they're the so-called abilities in the enterprise software space. Those are all still important, but the scale and availability requirements, the uptime requirements in particular, are just beyond what most companies could possibly imagine doing themselves. So sort of 4 nines plus kinds of availability. So 99.99% availability over the course of a year. And doing that is not trivial. So it's a huge engineering effort, and it's a big marketing and pricing effort and licensing effort as well. And so I was deep in the throes of that with a broader Exchange team. And eventually, of course, that spread to other teams inside of Office and the other business server products at Microsoft.
What a fantastic time to be in the internal workings of a company that was very much creating the foundation for how software would be built and sold in the 21st century, as we see the software revolution take hold. There were some industries that didn't gravitate towards software, mostly for security reasons, like the utility industry that you guys are currently working to empower and enable into scalable services that are not hosted on site. But before we jump into the problem that you've now spent the last 10 years solving, I was curious around not just the work that you did at Microsoft, but it seems to me that you did this at a very young age. Was Microsoft where you went to, I presume not straight out of undergrad, because you did mention a stint at Oracle?
Right, I was at Oracle for 1 year and then went to Microsoft.
Gotcha. And I'm always curious how folks, especially coming out of an esteemed university like Stanford, end up choosing the path that they want to take. How did you go about the thought process, or maybe even early work experiences that got you to decide on software and Oracle?
Yeah, that's a great question. At Stanford, I was an industrial engineering major of all things. And that key, which it doesn't exist under that name anymore at Stanford, it's now called something else, it is sort of more easily thought of as a degree in optimization, looking at systems and processes and figuring out how to optimize them. And the best internships I had during my undergrad years were 2 consecutive internships at Disney. Wow. Where I was working at Disneyland, in fact. And I had sort of really scrapped to get the first internship. I came home to Orange County. So I grew up in Orange County, and my mom and dad were down there. And so coming out of Stanford after my sophomore academic year, I was in June headed down, and my dad's saying, "Oh, what are you going to do this summer?" And I said, "Well, I'm really hopeful I'm going to get something at Disney. I've got a contact name that I pulled from the binder at the Career Center at Stanford, and I'm really optimistic this one's going to call me back." Well, my dad didn't think that was a very likely scenario, but I was sort of persistent in leaving this woman, Karen Hall, lots of voicemails, and I was back in Orange County, and she finally called, and she said, "Well, why don't you come in and see if you might be able to help us?"
So you cold emailed and called someone that you found in a book at Stanford?
Yeah. These days, it was pre. I'm undoubtedly this is online now, and I don't even know if there's a physical career center at Stanford anymore at all. But yeah, in those days, there was a physical little building, actually a very central building, right on the Stanford campus by one of the clock towers. That was the career center, and it was a very busy place, as you might expect, between about February and April or May. And then it sort of waned because people were finding things while I was in there looking around, probably starting in February or March, but also through May and into June before the academic year ended. And I had found Karen's information, and she was had been undergrad at Stanford and then done a master's, an MBA outside of Stanford, and was at Disney. And I thought, well, I was at Disneyland down in Orange County. I thought, well, if I got a job down there, I could live at home and go to the beach with my buddies and have a good time. And this would be great. And I could still have, work for an outstanding company. And, like I said, I finally got that call and went in to talk to her. And she sort of asked me about my Excel skills, and I had decent Excel skills. And she said, well, I've got this model, the attractions planning model, and I want you to work on it. That would be your summer project. Are you up for it? And I said, I'm in. And that thing was a gigantic Excel spreadsheet with some FoxPro database linkages. I think I was actually using Excel on a Mac back in those days, which I was familiar with, having come out of Stanford, which was a Mac school. Yeah, I got to work, and that attractions planning model was focused on the new Tomorrowland at Disneyland, and they were freshening up Tomorrowland. And then the next summer, I came back again and did a variety of different projects. And the interesting thing about those projects was they were sort of truly industrial engineering projects. So Disney, in the theme parks division, actively hires industrial engineers. In fact, the guy who's the president of the Disneyland Resort now, or the head of it, is an industrial engineering major from Stanford. The reason they do that is, if you think about a theme park, it is not that dissimilar from a factory in many ways. There are discrete units, and you want to efficiently move those units. The product at the end of the day for Disney is happiness, is enjoyment, is fun. And the company spends a lot of time thinking about that, but you have to move people around and you have to do it as efficiently as you can. And so the skills that you learn in industrial engineering around optimization, linear programming, things like this, those are directly applicable to queuing and ride throughput and things like that. And so there was a whole science around that, really, that the company developed and was actively using at all the parks around the world. So it was a great and fun thing to be part of. Through that, I got a lot of exposure to software, more exposure. And I was pretty good in Excel, but I will admit to needing to brush up on my skills. And so I actually read the Excel product manual. This is back when they shipped physical product manuals. And it was outstanding. I thought to myself, when I got to Microsoft, I should go find the people that wrote the Excel manual and thank them for doing such a great job writing an instruction manual that was actually enjoyable to read and just very well written. And that certainly helped me get that job done and do it well. And that helped me get the second internship, the second summer there. But yeah, that exposure to software, I definitely, and being at Stanford, just sort of in the heart of the valley, I could see the impact of software all around me. And it was an exciting space. And I knew I wanted to be part of it. So I ended up, in my senior year, I got an offer from Disney that I wasn't super happy with, because I didn't feel like it respected the 2 internships I'd had and a basically 0 ramp up time that I felt I had from an initial offering standpoint in terms of what the salary was. And I said, I'm going to hold out and look for other jobs. And so this was May when I declined. I had declined some other offers, and I remember talking to my dad on the phone and saying, oh yeah, I declined the Disney offer. And he was saying, what? You doing what? You don't have any job offers open? No, Dad, I'm going to hold out for a software job. Yeah, that was, he didn't go over well with my dad, but it worked out. I got an offer that summer after my senior year. I was on a road trip, and I think it was checking voicemail remotely. Back when you could call into your answering machine and check your voicemails people left for you, and had a call from Oracle. And so I went in and interviewed there and got an offer. And so started at Oracle in September of 96.
Most of the folks listening today are really interested in our global transition to clean energy. And as such, I would love to hear about your first exposure or foray into clean energy and wind and solar power. And when you decided or knew that that's kind of where you wanted to transition your career.
Yeah, it's a great question. So at Stanford, I had met a guy named Tom Hoff. And I was an undergrad, of course, and he was a PhD student. So he's 13 or so years older than me. And I got to know Tom and his family. He was one of the rare folks I knew at Stanford. One of the few folks lived on campus with a family, in grad student housing. And he had a family of 4, which was particularly exciting to go visit him in a small Stanford apartment. And Tom was in a program at Stanford called Engineering Economic Systems, which also doesn't exist anymore. And Tom was an ex-PG&E employee, utility guy, and had a focus in his career at PG&E, in the research group at PG&E, on solar. And I had an interest in solar just as far as an enabling technology, I remember writing a paper my sophomore year about something called the Iridium network. So this time, I believe it was Motorola had announced that they were going to deploy a constellation of satellites in low Earth orbit around the Earth called Iridium. It was named Iridium for the number of electrons in an iridium atom, which was either 66 or 77, I think. I forget now. But anyway, this notion of these many satellites communicating to allow for total Earth coverage with satellite phones for consumers. So not just for the military. The military's had that kind of stuff for a long time, but enabling the satellite coverage for consumers. And I wrote a paper for a graduate class I somehow slipped into at Stanford about the remote sort of sensing capabilities associated with this. And part of my proposition there was that, hey, these cellular or these satellites could sort of phone home to the Iridium network and, send data and readings and things from remote sensing stations for scientific purposes, right? Without using a relatively high bandwidth connection compared to what was then available for this kind of stuff. Part of that was, how do you power those things? And so I sort of looked into the solar aspects of using solar to power remote sensing stations. So when I met Tom, I think he had like a solar panel on his bookshelf, and he had a tiny office in this little apartment they had with all the kids, and he and his wife Elaine in there. And, we just hit it off. Talking about that stuff. And he told me about projects he'd worked on for PG&E, like Kerman out in California. And that just, piqued my interest more. So I certainly didn't become an energy guy at that point, but it encouraged me to follow both what Tom was doing and just what was happening with renewables in particular. I think a lot of engineers and scientists are sort of, even though they can understand how PV works or how different solar energy technologies work, they're still sort of semi-magical. It's just a great thing, a cool thing. I was certainly sort of smitten in that regard as well.
So you met Tom originally during your time at Stanford. Nonetheless, you went away for more than a decade, and I guess it would seem that you both ended up in the greater Seattle, Washington area. Tell me the story of how you came back around to Tom and clean power research.
I stayed in touch with Tom. So Tom had another year to finish his PhD after I got out. And so I think he left Stanford in 97. And when he got out, he went back to Napa, California, where he had been before he was at Stanford. And he started a company called Clean Power Research. And that was focused on consulting and research for really utilities and to some degree energy agencies and national labs like NREL. And I stayed in touch with him during this time. And in fact, when I got to Microsoft, I came down and visited, and I'd come down and visit them every other year. So the kids, it was fun to see the kids because I knew them since they were babies. It was just fun to watch them grow up a bit. And when I got on the tools team at Microsoft, I would send him software saying, hey, use Visual Studio, which was the collection, the sort of Microsoft Office bundle of tools, if you will. I'd send that to him and say, hey, use this stuff. And I also made sort of an important recommendation, which was, hey, if you can put this stuff online and charge subscriptions for it, that would be great. Now, this stuff at that point was primarily something that came to be called Clean Power Estimator, which is the company's first commercial product. And I think there's probably people listening to this that used it back in the day, and elements of it are still around, incorporated into our current Watt Plan product. But it was the first online nationwide solar calculator to enter your location, and from your location, it would allow you to choose a utility or make some assumptions about what your utility was, what your likely rate structure was, what your irradiance was, and then let you, model the economics and the energy impacts and the environmental impacts of solar for you. He had originally been developing that, of all things, as a Palm Pilot application. So some of your listeners will remember the Palm Pilot, which is actually a very popular device. Yeah. Probably the first super popular PDA.
Yeah, it was the only thing perhaps that BlackBerry disrupted.
Yeah, that's probably true. The Palm Pilots were all over the place. And so Tom was actually the calculator, the Clean Power Estimator calculator for that device. I think with the assumption that it would be used sort of sitting down at a table or standing in somebody's yard with a solar installer, as they looked up at their roof and said, oh, how much solar could I put up here, and what's it going to cost me, and how much am I going to save my electric bill? But he pretty quickly decided to put it online. And I was encouraging him, hey, definitely put it online and figure out charge a subscription for this. And so he did that. And in the meantime, he kept writing papers and doing research for utilities and for energy agencies, and had CEC contracts for research and things like that, CPUC contracts. That got some traction. The software did, Clean Power Estimator, and eventually was adopted by some utilities. And you mentioned, the utilities sort of being especially conservative and with regard to security and online software. And that's true. That's certainly true now. And I think they're utilities are doing their due diligence generally, is what we see. In those days, this is the late 90s and early 2000s, it was sort of a foreign concept, the notion that you'd let somebody else sort of run software for you. Though with Clean Power Estimator, it was somewhat palatable because we were just doing sort of relatively simple calculations, and we had all the resources to do that. We had the rates database. I say we, it was just Tom at the time, but he had the rates database and incentives database and irradiance database, et cetera. He needed to calculate things. He wasn't using account information from the utility or things like that. But when we got to PowerClerk in 2006 timeframe, that was a taller order to license to utilities because it was another hosted or online service, now what we would call SaaS, but it was both capturing and in some cases using sort of fundamental data for the utility and for the utility's customers, for the ratepayers. Even when I got here in 2008, for the first 3 or 4 years of really pushing PowerClerk, which I was in effect the product manager for PowerClerk at that time, those competitions were tough. The utilities were the notion that we would run this, maybe not mission critical, but increasingly critical thing for them and run it on servers that we maintain. That was a tall order to get folks over. Today, that's not really an issue. And certainly the traction that some of the big guys, Microsoft being an obvious example, obviously Amazon and Google, with software as a service and with enterprise services for software as a service, not just consumer services, that's certainly helped us as far as not having to convince so much utility IT and utility executives that this is any particularly unique or risky scenario.
Now, I feel pretty confident to say that if you're listening to Suncast, you are an infinite learner, always looking for a new approach. And that's precisely why CPS America has agreed to help make this fresh content possible for you each and every week. CPS is the USA market share leader of three-phase string inverters, pioneering that approach since before it was cool. With more than 2 gigawatts shipped in America, their feature-rich, high-performance inverters and nimble service team stand out in a sea of sameness, just like you do. If you'd like to find out what CPS can do for your C&I or utility-scale business, you can click their logo at mysuncast.com or shoot me an email for an intro and let them know that you heard it here on Suncast. Hey, Warrior, question for you. Are you losing commercial solar sales because of high demand charges that minimize return on investment? Extensible Energy's DemandX software is an affordable new solution for reducing peak demand charges by 30%. No batteries required. Extensible's intelligent software analyzes solar production, utility rates, weather data, and more. Then it crunches the data, monitors solar and flexible loads, and automatically reduces peak demand spikes, increasing your customers' ROI and decreasing payback time. Contact Extensible Energy at extensibleenergy.com for a free demand charge analysis for your project. Learn how Extensible's partner program for commercial solar installers can put more opportunities and money back in your balance sheet.
Jeff, for those who maybe aren't super familiar with PowerClerk and the other suite of products at Clean Power Research, perhaps at more of a 10,000-foot level, feel free to dive down any rabbit hole you choose, but how would you characterize the problem or problem set that you all are trying to solve at Clean Power Research now? And tell us a little bit about the tools that you've developed.
I mean, the company's mission is about powering the worldwide energy transformation. And we're doing that primarily with a suite of software solutions. And those solutions are all software as a service, or SaaS, as you heard me mention. So they're running in a cloud environment. We happen to run in the Amazon Web Services cloud environment. And they are licensed to our customers, utilities, solar developers, independent engineers, et cetera. And in some cases, those products are in turn used by end customers of those entities. So for example, PowerClerk, which is a general utility program automation tool, really started in handling solar incentives, but has evolved to handle interconnection and EV programs and all sorts of other types of programs. End users of that are both folks inside the utility who are automating, who are charged with running a program at the utility, a particular program or set of programs, and also their constituents. And those constituents outside the utility could be installers, say solar installers, or people putting in EV charging stations. And of course, they could also be consumers, customers, ratepayers. So, and those folks are maybe enrolling in a new program that the utility is offering, or trying to find more information and wanting to get on a regular communication program with the utility. Or they might be using a tool like WattPlan to understand the economics of a distributed energy resource technology, a DER. Most commonly that's solar, but increasingly it's EVs. It could be storage. They could be looking at understanding rates. As I think most of your audience is familiar with, solar has sort of upset, for lack of a better word, the rate philosophies of a lot of utilities. It's complicated, those approaches and philosophies. And so rates have changed in many jurisdictions. I think 2018 was a record-setting year for new rate cases before utility commissions in the US. That comes with a challenge of educating consumers. A lot of people don't inspect their utility bills very regularly or very deeply, and so they certainly can't be assumed to understand a very detailed rate or TOU rate or rate with demand charges or things like that. And so tools to help people understand those things, that's one of the areas WattPlan helps with. That's increasingly on the radar of the utilities, saying, hey, we owe it to our customers to do that. And in some cases, utility commissions and regulators are saying the same thing. And then there's one other product family, our Solar Anywhere product family. That's an interesting product family in that it straddles the line between utilities and energy professionals. Typical users of Solar Anywhere are independent engineers and solar developers who are using the irradiance data from Solar Anywhere to understand what the solar resource is in a particular location. So at the end of the day, the sort of most cared about number out of Solar Anywhere is some watts per meter squared metric of irradiance that can be then plugged into a model to model the potential output of a solar system. So one of the biggest consumers of Solar Anywhere is data and simulations is actually Clean Power Research, the rest of Clean Power Research itself, because WattPlan and PowerClerk both call into those tools. But the paying customers that use Solar Anywhere are a mix of utilities and solar developers, and then those independent engineers, and in some cases financiers as well, who are trying to understand the bankability of the projects that are being pitched to them by developers.
It can be, for those uninitiated, a dizzying array of options that the software can offer to the marketplace. And it's interesting that you have so many products housed sort of within the overarching Clean Power Research brand. I wonder if it's a fairly easy process to identify for those, again, who maybe you're still trying to figure out, like, how would I compare Clean Power Research in the market? Are there competitors or peers who also operate in this space that folks would recognize?
There are competitors, certainly. The traditional sort of competitor that we've seen on the PowerClerk front, and I say this not with my tongue in my cheek, has really been paper and Excel and PDF. That is to say that many of the, especially DER and renewables-oriented programs at utilities, have tended to start small, even at big utilities. And then as the demand has grown, the utilities and the energy agencies running those programs, not always utilities, have found themselves in a situation that's like, oh boy, we better get something to address this, to automate this, and to make the turnaround time faster for the customer, and to meet potentially the regulatory requirements we're under around processing time.
Yeah. In
terms of WattPlan and Solar Anywhere, they have direct competitors. So those would be companies that produce irradiance data in the case of Solar Anywhere, and there are companies in the US and in Europe and other parts of the world that do that. And then for WattPlan, it's fairly multifaceted from a competitive standpoint. There are quite a few EV competitors, so electric vehicle calculators, basically, that utilities use on their websites. Certainly, we're one of the big dogs in that field. And then there's a number that do PV calculators. I'm not aware of any that sort of have the comprehensive DER view that we have with PV, EV, storage, rates, and where we're going to be adding things over time, like heat pump water heaters and space heating and things like that. So we're taking a very holistic.
And that's within the WattPlan product?
That's in the WattPlan family, right? And in particular, the interesting thing we're doing there is making sure we model the interacting effects of those things. When you get a heat pump water heater, that's going to have an impact on what the space heating needs might be. And obviously, load's going to change when you have an EV. And so really modeling that, giving the customer an accurate sense of what's going to happen to their bill, the end customer. And then also on the back end, helping the utility understand what adoption might look like. That's a part of our WattPlan family now as well, with our so-called WattPlan Grid product. That product is about adoption propensity, or forecasting the likelihood of adoption of different things, and doing it in a bottoms up and a top down way, so that a utility can really understand, especially for things like EV and PV, where are those things likely to appear on my grid? What feeders are going to be impacted? When is that likely to happen? And at what scale is that likely to happen? So they can model different scenarios of adoption and then, adjust rates and business models to address those.
Yeah, one of the things that comes to mind for me as I'm thinking about, and I'm not sure where all, obviously, PowerClerk is targeting from a utility perspective, but great example right now, as you mentioned, a competitor basically being paper and Excel models is the island of Puerto Rico. Many of our listeners will be familiar with how Puerto Rico is undergoing a massive transition right now, and how PREPA is being managed. And one of the biggest problems that they have, speaking on behalf of the solar installers on the island, is that PREPA, the utility, just doesn't really have an efficient way to manage their incentive program. Can you give examples like that where utilities are currently leveraging PowerClerk and some of the other tools to accelerate their own transition where they had previously been stuck?
I think the original high scale example is the California Solar Initiative. So that was run on the first version of PowerClerk, which is now a deprecated legacy version of the product that we don't onboard customers to. That helped the CSI scale to the levels that it did. And in fact, there's still some small elements of CSI active, and we're still running PowerClerk for the CPUC and the utilities in California to run some of those ongoing programs. But that was many hundreds of thousands of applications, incentive applications that flowed through that. Another great example that's been talked about publicly is Southern California Edison, where for interconnection, so not incentives now, but for handling interconnection, they run that on PowerClerk, and they reduced their interconnection time down from 60 or 70 days down to less than 3 days, with many applications being same day. And that's because of some of the automation capabilities in PowerClerk and the ability to really understand and branch in terms of workflow how different applications are handled. So for example, if an application is less than 10 kilowatts, put it on this fast track, and maybe that can be approved in a matter of minutes or hours. In some cases, our customers don't even touch certain applications based on criteria, don't have a human review them at all. Things that are larger are more likely to get reviewed. Some of our customers use random auditing techniques that PowerClerk helps them with, so that they can, even for things that are totally automated or semi-automated, they can randomly audit to make sure that the installers or other applicants are actually following the rules of the program.
There seem to be a lot of markets, not just domestic in the United States. I'll name Duke, who famously uses their interconnection queue process as a way to stiff arm the expansion of renewables, which I'm sure you guys have to deal with. But how about in places like Mexico, and I mentioned Puerto Rico, but places internationally where you see growth opportunities, namely Mexico has a sort of under 500 kilowatt commercial application process that's virtually over the counter, but with the energy transition has run into a lot of issues with timing, similar to what you were mentioning with SoCal Edison on the interconnection side, where they can't seem to get out of their own way. How are you seeing your products used to scale outside of the United States?
A number of our products are being used internationally, but it's primarily in terms of Solar Anywhere, where companies are using solar resource data internationally to consider siting generally utility scale plants. Some cases commercial, but it's generally utility scale. PowerClerk and WattPlan at this point are not being used internationally. So we have had conversations with some of the entities you mentioned, and we have bid PowerClerk into some international opportunities. But right now, we haven't had a focused effort on taking the products internationally. That is changing. We're working on that from a software perspective. So in the software world, to take a product international, depending on its nature, you have to do something called internationalization. And that's the process you go through to allow the software to handle different languages, to handle them efficiently. So one approach would be, imagine some piece of software. You just make a copy of that software, and then you have somebody sort of go through by hand and translate all the strings, all the text, and any other motifs that wouldn't make sense to somebody in another country or speaking another language potentially. That is an approach, but it's not a scalable approach. And that's because you are probably going to want to translate the product or be able to license and sell it in other markets as well. And so then you're adding ever more languages. And Microsoft's probably the best example of this. Their products are available in 60 some languages for products like Office. And so to have that capability, you have to have this internationalization capability. And what that means is plumbing the software products so that all the strings that go into those products can be efficiently pulled out of resource files and easily translated. And that's the sort of thing that gives you an experience as a user that you might be familiar with clicking a flag for Spanish at the top of a website or inside an application, and the user interface immediately changes. So that's a process we're in the middle of with a number of our products, particularly PowerClerk and WattPlan, is internationalizing these products because we do see that market potential. But for SaaS, there are some other issues as well. One of the things that we'll be doing is we'll be running those products on AWS in those locales. So, if you're in Australia, we'll run on AWS in Australia. If you're in South America, we'll run on AWS in South America. And there are multiple reasons to do that. The two primary ones are security sensitivities around data exfiltration from those countries, which are reasonable. We have most of our utility customers here in the U.S. have similar requirements that we handle the data here in the U.S. So you can't fault somebody in Brazil for feeling the same way. And the other one is just simple performance and reduced latency, so that the experience of using that web interface, if you're an interactive user, or if it's a software to software communication, because most of our products are API enabled, where they may be talked to by other software over the internet. You want that to be snappy. You want it to be low latency and the ability to push a lot of data back and forth. If you do, we're talking about things like interval data or other high frequency, large scale data.
I would love to get your thoughts or insight on how you feel working with Bill, seeing how he as a CEO is running Microsoft, provided you with the tools that you currently employ now as a CEO of a leading software company in the space that you occupy.
Being able to be around Bill so much, both sort of one-on-one and then especially in group contexts, did expose me to a lot of how he manages things. And he certainly had, and to some degree has, a reputation for asking hard questions. I think he did that. In my experience of watching him, he always did that respectfully, but he was very passionate. And the thing that struck me about whether he was in email or as a so-called Bill review, the sort of product reviews that the big products had at Microsoft at least every year with Bill in the room, it was always the context of we. So Bill wouldn't call people out and say, or call a product team out and say, you did this wrong. It was always, we have to be better. Why can't we do this? He was asking the hard questions, but doing it in the standpoint of how can we be better and why aren't we serving customers well? He's sort of famous for these longish rant emails where he goes and tries a product at home, say installs some new thing. There's a pretty famous one floating around the web about, I think it was Windows Movie Maker. I think maybe Todd Bishop published that rant. It was an internal email. It's sort of funny to read because Bill's sort of ripping on the product, but he doesn't do it and say, you engineers are terrible. He's saying, why can't we be better? And why is this so difficult? And how are we going to allow customers to really use this and not have people balk and go, buy something else or go buy a Mac or whatever it might be. Yeah. So I think he took it upon himself when I was working for him, he was the chairman and chief software architect. He was no longer CEO. He took it upon himself as being both the biggest cheerleader for the company to some degree, though maybe not as vociferous as Steve Ballmer, but also the company's critic, right? The company's sort of deeply introspective critic. So that was self-criticism. We should be better. And why are these things so hard or inelegant or error prone? Why are there the seams between the products that should be integrated? Customers are seeing the Microsoft brand on these things. They should work together. And so that, for me, that was a cultural element of Microsoft. I think that sort of introspection and self-criticism and understanding how to learn and adapt and make things continually better. But I've certainly applied that here at Clean Power Research. And with 3 product families, I mean, we're a relatively small company, about 50 people, but we have, it's unique for a company of the size of Clean Power Research of only 50 people to have 3 successful product families. So we're in a very fortunate position. I think a lot of, if we had outside investors, which we don't, I think a lot of them would be saying, well, why don't you focus on X rather than these other things? We're playing a long game here, and we have an approach and a strategy that involves integrating these products together and making things truly better together. And that's not unlike what we were doing at Microsoft and what Bill was certainly sort of shepherding along.
Given some of the folks that you've had the pleasure of interacting with, and not least which is Tom, the founder of Clean Power Research, I'd love to hear if there are any particular key lessons or takeaways from these mentors in your career that you would share with us.
Sure. I think, certainly Bill was was a unique opportunity to both work with Bill for 2.5 years, and then he was very gracious in being my mentor for my years after I was done working for him, which was 5 years, where I was still at 4.5 years, I was still at Microsoft, and still regularly visiting with him. So there were certainly a lot of takeaways there. I mentioned some of them in terms of asking hard questions and really understanding where those seams in the products are, and making sure that you're looking deeply at things and being self-critical. For Tom, Tom is a rare bird in my experience. He is a PhD. He is a deeply analytical person. He is a very humble guy and very genuinely humble. And he's like a kid in a candy store when he gets into deep energy questions and the data surrounding them. He just has such a deep passion and curiosity. And he really inspires people with that passion. And it's not in a way that sort of, you must do this and driven that way. It's very much imagine the things we could do if we could understand this better. In some ways, he's like Bill in that they're both deeply optimistic. They think about the possibilities of what software and what technology can do to solve some of these huge problems we're facing, in terms of climate, in terms of energy. Tom, he just loves to share what he's thinking about and learn from others about how we might be able to apply some of that work. So he's been great to work with. I think he's also got a natural business sense, which that's another aspect that makes him, I think, pretty rare for somebody who's as deeply technical as he is. He and I complement each other very well, because I'm very much an enterprise software guy and a manager, and I love to be an individual contributor as well. Certainly in my position now, I'm more a manager than I am an individual contributor. But Tom has, from the earliest days of the company, when it was really just him, before I joined, he had contractors working for him, but he certainly set a tone of collaboration and collegiality that is still here. So we're a very technical group here, mostly scientists and engineers, including in marketing and even some of our non-technical roles. Lots of people have technical backgrounds, but we very much have a friendly atmosphere, and there's a shared passion for the types of problems we're solving here that I think is largely because of the culture he initiated when he founded the company.
Yeah, I may have to have Tom on as well, hear a bit more about his story at some point in the future. I would love to know, given that it is an organization that's focused on the future and very passionately looking out beyond the horizon that most people are capable of sort of comprehending in many cases. I feel like the products that have been created by Clean Power Research have helped rather than push our industry forward, which is great. I'd love to know, in that context, what corners are you looking around? What's got you most excited right now about the overall growth of the clean energy business?
Oh boy, there's so many. I think we've definitely seen. We work with a lot of utilities, of course. That's 70% of our business is to utilities, and their focus now is changed in that it's not solely PV or solely focused on one technology. It is much more about DERs, and the level at which DERs and renewables are being considered is being raised in the organization. And so the sort of traditional utility mindset or stereotype of utility mindset of, oh, solar is a pain, it's just difficult for us, we don't have to worry about renewables. We see that less and less today. Utilities are trying, and in many cases succeeding, in being leaders and thinking about how to deploy renewables. And in many cases, that's either toward a specific renewables goal or mandate, but often it's just a leadership and a vision from the company that either has to do with carbon or specific renewables targets that aren't imposed. And so that's a refreshing change to see. You could argue about, okay, what does that motivation come from? And folks have talked about things like the utility death spiral and fears about self-generation and what that means for utilities in the long term. But from what I've seen, it's the utilities sort of recognizing that they have a great deal of customer trust in many cases. They're known to be reliable, and as far as their core job, which is providing safe, reliable power, they do that very well. And so they are the natural folks to step in many cases and be leaders on this energy transformation. So it's refreshing to see that increasingly be the case across the country.
Do you see or foresee any particular disruption, or maybe you would herald the coming of this or that sort of new technology or focus beyond the macro of DERs?
There's a lot happening. I think the impact of storage is going to be interesting to see, how that plays out. What really happens at the residential scale versus at the utility scale for storage. A lot of our customers are asking about that. I think one of the things that we're increasingly seeing that we're pretty excited about internally, based on actually some of the research Tom himself is doing, is how are we going to get to some of these aggressive goals, whether utility imposed or utility commission mandated, so utility self-imposed or mandated by regulators. How are we going to get to some of these goals around carbon and renewables without, or I shouldn't say without, how are we going to get to those goals in terms of addressing the existing environment of, for example, houses? So there's certainly new houses being built, and that's a commonly cited sort of economic indicator, but most of us don't live in new houses. In fact, the day we move in, I guess it's not a new house anymore, right? So this existing housing stock around the country is highly variable in terms of things like the levels of insulation and what the heat sources are and how water's heated, and does the house have natural gas service, does it just have electric service? And so understanding and quantifying the potential for impact towards some of these goals with this existing housing stock is a very interesting problem. And we've been working on something called the virtual energy audit, which is a way to characterize homes using some software technologies in a way that's very minimally invasive compared to a traditional home energy audit that involves a blower door test and things like that. Mm-hmm. Utilities we're sort of pitching that in its early phases to utilities, and there's a pretty, I'd say, positive reception to some of those capabilities as far as saying, okay, how are we really going to do this on a wide scale? If you've got home audits that are happening to, less than 1% or maybe less than 2% of your customers every year, it's going to take you a long time to really understand what's out there and have the influence with your customers to make smarter energy choices. But if you can do that by intelligent interval data analysis, so smart meter data analysis in effect, as well as some other approaches for understanding energy usage characteristics of the home, and provide a more proactive set of recommendations for customers as the utility. So clean power research technology working through the utility, as many of our products like WattPlan do, then you've got a potentially larger reach and can have an impact sooner. And I think there's a growing awareness that existing housing stock and people's personal vehicles and things like that are big players in both electrification targets and renewables targets, and certainly from a decarbonization standpoint.
Jeff, you mentioned earlier that, like Bill, you are an avid reader. I often say here that readers are leaders and leaders are readers. I'd love to know from your treasure trove of readership, what books have you perhaps gifted or recommended the most, and why?
Yeah, the one I've gifted most for the last few years has been Mindset, which is, I think, now a pretty widely known book by Carol Dweck, who's from Stanford, coincidentally. I know that Satya Nadella has recently publicized in the last year or so that he's widely encouraged executives at Microsoft to read that book. But I found that book to be inspiring, and I think because Carol uses a lot of examples from undergraduates and high performers she met while at Stanford, sort of resonated with me in that regard. And I think I've mostly given it to younger people, so people getting out of undergrad or getting their master's degrees, and I think it's been pretty well received. Right now on my nightstand, there is a anthology of science fiction short stories, so not quite as a little more fun than Mindset.
And what is that book?
It's the 2018 anthology of science fiction short stories. So it's got a whole host of it's probably 30 or 40 different short stories. I'm maybe only a third of the way through it right now. So, but it's just fun stuff.
As we round third base here, heading for home, I have a couple more questions that I'd love your insight on. What habit or consistent practice has for you given the greatest leverage or impact for your work?
I'd say being close to the product teams. So I am the CEO, but I try to use the products regularly. I like to demo the products when I get out and talk to customers. I like to demo the products myself. And this is not unlike what Bill would do. Bill would take a product home or install it at home and then sort of write this rant email. I occasionally write a similar rant emails, but mostly I'm trying to get hands-on with the products and, again, understand where those seams are and work through them. And one of the ways I'm able to do that is I spend more time probably meeting with internal folks than I do with external folks. And actually, not probably, certainly I do. And so the product meetings every week that we have for the pre-product families, I'm in those meetings. The deep dives that we do quarterly, I'm in those meetings. And so I'm fairly hands-on as far as understanding the products. I'm not micromanaging the products by any stretch, but I want to know where they're headed. I want to know what their feature prioritization lists are. And I want to go use those things as soon as they're on a test server and a staging server where I can go play with them. I'm a product guy and a software guy, so I like to be hands-on.
I will certainly list places like Twitter at Clean Power Res, and certainly you have one of the best website URLs in our industry, cleanpower.com.
There's a good story behind that, actually.
Oh, yeah? Yeah, sure. Go for it. When
I joined Tom, it took Tom 2 years to convince me to leave Microsoft because I had a great career there, and I'm still a big fan of the company. But he finally convinced me to join him at Clean Power Research. And one of the things I was not wild about was that the URL for the company was clean-power.com. So all things considered by modern standards may not be that bad, but I really wanted us to have cleanpower.com. And cleanpower.com was pointing to, and this is the honest to God truth, a lightning arrestor company in Idaho. And the interesting thing was, if you went to cleanpower.com, so this would have been in, say, 2006, 2007, it would redirect to a different URL. This guy was probably relatively successful selling lightning arrestors, but he clearly wasn't using the Clean Power domain too heavily because it was redirecting to his primary domain, which I don't remember what it was, Idaho lightning arrestors or something like that. And I said, this is an opportunity. The thing I did that was smart was to spend 20 minutes or 30 minutes reading about how to buy a domain and do that anonymously. And I did that. And I think I spent all in $4,500 to get cleanpower.com from that guy. For a long time, I considered that one of the company's most valuable assets was that domain name. But so a funny story behind it. But I hope that guy's doing well with his lightning arrestors, and we appreciate that he let cleanpower.com go.
Well, let's end today, Jeff, as we always do, with a bold prediction. What one thing do you see happening in the market that perhaps nobody else is tracking? Of the many things that we've talked about today, I wonder if there's anything new that you might say is in your crystal ball.
I would say it probably relates to just this convergence around DERs as an entity a collection of entities that the utility cares about. And our experience with utilities on DERs is that they're increasingly thinking about them in the context of what is a customer's energy journey? What does a customer need today? What are the natural life cycles of purchases that may affect them from an energy perspective? That could be replacing a water heater. It could be buying a new car. And how can the utility help with that? And in particular, how can they help with it towards some of these ends of electrification and greenhouse gas reduction? So that's an exciting change to see, as I alluded to earlier. And it's one that seems to be accelerating and very much nationwide. So not a coastal phenomenon, but one we're seeing pop up all over the place.
Yeah. So for those who have made it all the way through and aren't familiar with DERs, that's distributed energy resources, there's a whole body of work around how DERs are, in fact, not just changing the landscape for utilities and consumers, but expanding our capacity, literally and virtually, to absorb more renewable energy nationwide and globally. I would agree with you there that DERs are on a convergence path, and utilities are starting to really lean in that direction. Jeff Ressler is the CEO at Clean Power Research, where they create tools for advancing the energy transformation. We talked about Power Clerk, Watt Plan, Solar Anywhere, their suite of products, and it was a fantastic, fascinating journey. Jeff, thank you for helping us understand more about not just the product suite that you guys have developed, but how it came to be and the ways in which it's impacting our global energy transition.
Thank you, Nico. I appreciate it.
Hey, Warrior, I'm honored that you're still here with me. That puts you in a very small group of folks truly dedicated to growing and learning. I learned a ton here today in Jeff's conversation, but there's always more to glean, am I right? If you'd like to have more time with Jeff and I, then make sure you're signed up in the Tribe newsletter, where we're going to be announcing a webinar-style Ask Me Anything with Jeff, where you can ask him directly all those lingering questions that come up for you during today's chat. As always, you can find the resources and highlights from the discussion today, along with the social media links, over on the blog at mysuncast.com. Hey, while you're there, would you please take 2 minutes more of your life and to fill out our listener survey? It really does help me mold this program into something that really serves you better. Thanks again to our Guild members and our sponsors who help make this podcast free to you. You can learn more about both at mysuncast.com. Remember, you are what you listen to. Thanks again for showing up, Solar Warrior. It's half the battle.